Chapter 6 King and Mastersmith. The cog showed no sign of heading towards any of the berths, but rather moved out into the center of the channel where the wind was clearest. Looking ahead, Elof was surprised to see that the channel led on into the bounds of the city, between hard walls of gray stone, faceless and windowless, much like the dockside storehouses of their own cities. He was even more surprised that it was only one of many such that wound about between the buildings, till distance dwindled them to threads glistening in the shadow of the citadel. Here and there he could even make out a mast against the rooftops. Yet the ground does rise, however slightly. Can it be they've some kind of lock system here, as the Duergar do? This proved to be so, for when the cog rounded a bend in the channel, it slackened sail, and two heavy water gates closed behind it. Rock, who had never seen the Duergar's dark rivers under stone, was fascinated as the waters came churning through the sluices. He had a great love for all cunning devices that needed no smithcraft in their operation. The cog rose swiftly, and as the further gates swung open, it went gliding off down the new channel. This brought a further surprise. After the blank dockside buildings, they were now passing between unmistakable rows of houses, though there was little life about them as yet. Only a chimney smoked here and there, and a baby cried in the distance. The streets were empty, and the water of the channel glass calm, mirroring buildings and blue skies. The cog glided cloud-like over the reflected rooftops, and strewed flecks of golden light in its wake. The houses themselves, built against one another in blocks large and small, were pleasing in proportion, many-storied and high-gabled. Some had lime-washed walls, others were even plastered smooth and painted in pastel colors, pink and apple green and soft blue. But most looked old and faded, and in some the plaster had faded to a flecked brown and begun to crack and peel away. A few had bands of decoration across the frontage between floors, so tangled and florid that even Elof, used to archaic scripts, was slow to recognize them as old saws and mottos, fragments of simple verse and the like. The town was beginning to come to life. A pump creaked noisily in the courtyard. Chimneys smoked. One or two figures could be seen going about the narrow lanes. A breeze wafted them the odor of baking, and though different from the cornbread they knew, it was no less irresistible. When the odor of frying meat drifted up to them from the deck braziers, not even the excitements of the view could match it, and they went sliding like madmen down the shrouds. At first, Rock bolted his breakfast, afraid they might arrive at the citadel soon, till Elof pointed out that its towers, still visible over the rooftops even from the deck, looked only a little nearer. At this gentle pace, they had a good half-day's sailing ahead, at the least. This turned out to be too slight a guess, for to the scale of the great sprawling burg, their minds were not yet attuned. Now and then, too, the cog must slow its pace, as the wind grew less or some other ship slid by it, fresh sails glistening in the bright sun, barring the breeze from the cog's stained square of strengthened linen. Then Elof almost had to restrain Rock from springing ashore, so eager was he to tread these ancestral streets. By this one and that the channels led them, from lock to lock, ever rising. Quarter after quarter rolled smoothly by them, like illuminations on some vast, unending scroll, divided by the channels and the grim encircling walls, now breached in many places, and even plundered for house stone. As they went deeper, the fine dwellings grew gradually more dilapidated, and soon gave way to older streets of sullen tenements, upper stories overhanging their muddy alleys, till at the top they all but met. Often crude gangways, rattling like dry bones in the breeze, ran between them in rough parody of the flying buttresses in the citadel above. But this poor quarter, large as it was, ended sharply at a broad channel. On the far side were blank walls of brick, more faceless storehouses. Here and there among them, narrow sluices spilled fast streams into the channels, and when Elof climbed to the masthead again, he saw huge water wheels turning under artificial falls. Behind them, a few tall chimneys smoked, spewing smuts and cinders at him along the breeze. Here evidently was a gathering of manufactories, with kilns for pottery or baked brick. Huddled in their smoky lee was a patch of decent houses and a bustling little market, and beyond them more of the faceless storehouses, ending in another canal. Past these were more houses, more canals, and then a long and august roof tree of some 5 stories that was unmistakably a guild hall, built much as they were in Morvenhall. Other guild halls followed, and beyond them the tall, narrow counting houses of a merchant's quarter, very like that of Kerbrahine. It set them thinking of their old friend Cathel, the merchant, and how he was faring far off in the embattled west. But it was another quarter that brought home most sharply the kinship of this land with theirs. They came first upon a wall of dense woodland, a slice of hunting park isolated like a veritable island between 2 curving channels that might once have been natural streams. Into the furthest of these the cog turned, and they saw that beyond it reared a row of walls so blind and windowless, so weather-stained and streaked to such a dismal shade of gray, that they might have been more storehouses, save only that they were too tall and too noble in proportion. And as the cog sailed gracefully by, with 2 white swans as heralds, Elof could make out that their wide roofs were not solid, but hollow at the center, and also that the few outer windows they displayed, all in the uppermost stories, were many of them glazed with jeweled colors, and flanked by richly carven shutters. "Remind you of anywhere?" Rock inquired. Elof gestured at one doorway, surmounted by a carven shield whose blazon was blurred and unreadable with weathering, a mere mass of hollows and pits upon the stone. "Need you ask? Kermorven's ancestral house. Any other noble house in Kerbrahine. Courts, 4 walls of rooms, almost all the windows facing inwards, well hidden from the world outside, from their noble rivals and the assertions of levies, assessors of levies." "And from the commons," growled Rock. "That's what it really means, I guess. Wall out even the sight of the poor, that you can wallow in your wealth in peace. Look at the way that woodland screens off the whole fine quarter." "It may not be wholly their fault," said Elof. "Under some kings, even quite good kings, it might be bad for your purse or your standing to appear too openly rich." "And under the not-so-good, for your health also? Well, maybe," grunted Rock, unconvinced. "But hear this. I asked Kermorven about this fashion once, seeing it wasn't the way in Morvanic, with all our palaces clear and open. Rich or poor, folk have always trusted each other over there. He told me it dated only from the declining years of Morven. taken thence like much else rotten by the rebels, who became the first syndics, that it was never the way in Morvanic, nor in Caris. And you'll allow my Lord Kermorvan's a bright lad. When he says the lore is so-and-so, thus it is. Then, it must have come about at some time since the lands were sundered. Powers, there's been time enough. Aye, but in both countries, following the same path, the same ill path. Again? Elof frowned. Well, they spring from the same root. They might well grow the same way. But no, you're right. I cannot believe it either. Not when Norderney and Morvanic have managed to be so different. It is more as if the others display the symptoms of the same disease. Ah, breathed Rock. Like it might be a cold, you mean? Elof smiled grimly. Caught in a chill wind off the ice, yes, it might be. Its hand can be subtle at times, and no less cruel, and it has many generations to study the flows and currents within the hearts of a people, and seek to channel them. Remember that as well as yours and Kermorvan's, this is also the ancestral homeland of Brihon Briheren. Rock shuddered. But if even Karis is infected, what's the chances for the rest of us? Every chance. Remember Tapayao, who despised men too much to be able to understand us? The ice is 10 times worse off, Rock. It hates us. It makes the worst assumptions about us. If we do not live up to them, we stand a better chance of escaping its snares. Ah, said Rock moodily, eyeing those walls, whose forbidding drabness seemed almost a reversed mold of the richness within. But what's the likelihood of that here, do you think? After all we've seen? Still a good chance, Elof answered him calmly, so long as the infection has not yet reached the heart. And that, I guess, we are about to find out. The cog was gliding out from between the tall and insular houses of nobility and between another belt of woodland, growing against and over the most ancient walls they had yet seen, long since abandoned to the ravages of weather and wood. The channel lost its straightness and began to wind mazily about the buildings ahead. Clearly, it had once been a river here, before stone built up its banks and its channel was dredged. The buildings themselves took on a less even and upright look. There was no prevailing shape or size or fashion as in the outer quarters, save that they were all many stories high and built against one another, with few wide ways between. But here and there archways opened onto stairs and alleys that ran through the buildings themselves like wormholes, as if space had been too precious to leave them open to the sky. Some buildings seemed more ancient even than the walls. Others were brash and brightly new. Some, and not always the old ones, gaped emptily like skulls, while their neighbors stood in fine repair, and in many of their windows lights shone, although it was still only the middle of the afternoon, for in the shadow of the citadel they huddled, and behind its towers, for them, the sun had already set. Some half-hour later, around a shallow bend in the river, appeared a row of wharves, with tall buildings behind them. Walkways and galleries ran across their faces, overhanging the river, and between them many a complex hoist and crane for unloading. Elof and Rock stood beside Trikegar at the helm as, with a heady blend of cursing and great dexterity, he swung the cog alongside the furthest of the wharves, a vast grim affair of tapered stone blocks. Under the eyes of two bored-looking sentries, men in dark liveries ran to take up the lines thrown ashore, hauled in the cog bow and stern, till the long fenders of straw-stuffed canvas grated and squeaked against the stone, and made it fast. The crewmen were already beginning to strike the sail, and as it slid rustling and flapping from the mast, it unveiled, like a curtain before a picture, the most startling prospect Elof had ever seen. "The strength of Keris, masters," said Trikegar, "within the old town, by the royal wharves, great arteries of the city, heart of the heart's heart, the pivot about which the wide world spins, and for your worthy selves, voyage's end. May it be a fair omen to ya. Pray, don't forget the poor skipper." But he chuckled quietly as he spoke, as if he knew he would get no answer. Evidently, he was well aware of how this sight struck a newcomer. As a distant hill or a bulk looming like a low cloud mass behind rooftops, it had been an easier thing to accept, or, if need be, to ignore. But it could not be ignored here, for they stood at its very foot, and behind it the sky was fading to layers of blue-gray cloud interleaved with hues of peach and gold, a royal mantle draped about a crown. Like a crown indeed rose the strength of Keris, a crown of many tiers and ornaments, and faced about with jewels. And these jewels were edifices tall and fair in their own right. Of every kind and form they were, low and long and robust, square and strong, squat and fortified, tall and graceful and spire-crowned. Palace and castle, hall and hallow, all were here, set high about those slopes like fruit in a tree, with 100 smaller shapes scattered in their shadow. Seeing them from afar, Elof had not guessed how great they were in their own right, nor how fair in their several ways. Not one but would have graced the heart of any city among men. The high gate might be greater than any of them, but it was far less fair. His eyes followed a long stair, picked out in the long sunlight like the many-branched limb of a vast tree, from one of the tall, tapering gatehouses set in the walls encircling the slope's foot, up to the level of a bulwarked fortification, outthrust in the arc of a half-moon to dominate the slope with dignity and strength. Around this and above the staircase wound, between smaller halls and up to a great frontage, bearing 2 sweeping spires that echoed the towers above. The stairway parted before it, swept up around and behind its steep-pitched roof tree to the 2 ends of a wide terrace. Upon this stood a palace built like embracing arms, a wide-windowed residence with nothing of the fortress about it. Up the slope it rose in curving steps, the stairways weaving about it, till it ended in a single high conical turret. From there, over a bridge that curved like the rainbow, the stair crossed to the first of a stepped pyramid of terraces. From the highest of these, the towers arose. So much he saw along one stair from one gate. But in that side of the wall alone, there were a dozen such gates, and as many stairs, and around many of those the buildings clustered more thickly. Elof could not take in a half of what he saw there. Time was not given him. He jumped at the crash of the gangway upon the quay, and the roar of the sergeant's voice, mustering the guard. The soldiers came clattering along to form up on the deck, and suddenly, after 2 weeks of lazy informality, they had the look of guards once again. The sergeant clumped up the gangplank to exchange words with the sentries on the quay. Elof, without turning, spoke to Trikegar. "Shipmaster?" "Aye, Master Smith." "You're of northern stock, and the seas are the northerner's birthright. Are you happy sailing all your life upon river and channel?"
"Happy enough, lad," said Trikegar guardedly. "We never reckoned much on the sea, not knowing who or what lay beyond it. Anyhow, birthright or no, the man-eaters stand in the way of it now, as of so much else. And not only them."
The sentries, looking agitated, were summoning somebody from the building at the rear. Elof bit his lip. Over the last few days they had told the old seaman much of their voyages, and he had seemed enthralled and envious. But there had never till now been a free moment when they might safely sound him out, and there was little time for persuasions. Search your heart, shipmaster. Is there not, deep down, the least longing to make one great voyage, unbarred by bank or boundary, to sail like the sky wanderers, free upon the winds of the world, to find a fair land and a free kindred, and help against our common foe?
"Not in this here cog, master."
Trikegar grinned as he might at an over-enthusiastic boy. But Elof had seen his light green eyes shift suddenly, seemed to gaze at a far gray horizon. "And if I found you a fit craft?" hissed Elof. "A seaworthy craft? Couldn't get one past the gate, and there's no sea-coast free to build on. Where'd you ever get such a craft?" "From the Egwesh, of course," said Elof impatiently. "If you could find a crew?"
"From the—"
repeated Trikegar, and began to laugh softly.
"By Sathana's belly."
He shook his head in happy disbelief. "Then you'll come?" The sergeant was saluting two plump men who came striding up from the rear, evidently officials of some kind. They were quizzing him rapidly and darting surprised glances at the travelers. Trikegar fell silent suddenly, pressing his lips till his small mustaches bristled.
"By the horns of the bull, with such lads as you twain, I just might. There'd be no problem about a crew, not among us old northerners. I might. But when?
Who can tell? So much depends on what we may do here, on your Lord's word, among other things. A day, a year.
Oh, that it take not 10 years. Past that, I might be too old. Get you word to me when you know, whatever my Lord says. Then we'll see."
There was a sudden fire in his soft tones.
"Lads, if it's at all possible I'm your man. Daft I may be, but I'd not miss this last endeavour if I did have to wait 10 years.
"Maybe it will not take so long," said Elof quietly. "But however long, I shall still call upon you, shipmaster."
"Do you so? Fare you well, Master Smith, and my thanks."
The officials were nodding vigorously now, and abruptly one turned on his heel and stalked away. The sergeant turned back down the gangway swiftly, and tossed Elof and Rock a crisp salute that was as good as a command.
"By your leave, gentles,"
One of the sailors sought to take up the bag that was all their gear, but Elof forestalled him, graciously enough, and let the sergeant usher them over the gangway, with the escort clumping behind. He heard a sharp intake of breath from Rock as he set foot upon the deep, worn stone of the wharf. At long last his feet rested upon his ancestral land. But they were not to remain there long. The sergeant led them towards a great gibbet crane at the rear of the wharf, and ushered them up short steps onto the dais beneath. A broad square of stone walls supporting a raised floor of wood with a low railing around it. It looked so like a hanging gibbet that Elof found himself uneasily scanning the boards for signs of a trap. He told himself angrily that he was growing foolish, and turned to the doors at the back. Then he recoiled in alarm, suspecting he knew not what snare, as he felt something snap taut underfoot, and the dais judder. "Do yer take hold, sirs," warned the sergeant, himself seizing one of the rails. Rock swore in horror as with an alarming squeal the whole contraption, themselves, their escorts, and all, was plucked bodily from the ground. The doors swung open before it, and Rock swore again. A long ramp of smooth stone stretched out before them, rising straight and high among the buildings above, and running the length of it, 2 deep parallel slots. Through them ran 2 heavy cables, singing with tension. Looking back, he saw the same 2 running down into the empty space beneath the dais and into a mass of pulleys and wheels. They were standing upon some kind of winched platform, set on an angled carriage to keep it level as it was hauled up the ramp. He peered over the edge to see the small iron wheels running in the slots, and was all but tipped over the side by a sudden jerk. "Have a care, sirs," the sergeant warned. "Faster and easier than the 1,000 stairs is this, but no smooth ride. Stretching in the cable, they always say, though like as not it's their own idle hands shirking the task." "Hands? You mean it's men hauling this weight up?" "By a capstan, to be sure," shrugged the sergeant. "Expensive by paid labour, but there's never a shortage of sturdy rogues from the jails, even if they need their backs tickled now and again." Elof hoped he had not noticed Rock's tactless grimace. Evidently, they were thinking the same thing. Water power would manage the job better and cheaper, even if the cost of building was higher. Either Karis had lost its once famed skills in that art, or it no longer cared. He did not like to think which. At any rate, they had not learned the art of drawing and plaiting wires of steel into strong and unstretching cables. That was clear. They were rising high now, cresting the rooftops. The platform was catching the breeze and beginning to sway. After the first shock, Elof and Rock, not long from the mastheads, hardly minded the sensation. But the soldiers clung grimly to the stanchions, and even the sergeant was a shade paler beneath his bricky color. Already they were over the outer walls of the Strength, and passing among its host of roofs. It startled Elof to see so great a mass of stone reaching such a height. It seemed to war with all he knew of the mason's art. This tower thrust at the heavens. But as they passed the terrace and gallery, square and street shelved out from the slopes, he began to appreciate the vast skill of its shaping. Grand and imposing as was the Strength from a distance, at closer sight it seemed far less substantial, a thing of lightness and air and outlines rather than of bulk, of arches that soared like an arrow's flight made stone, heavy buttresses that surged like carven waves, lighter flying buttresses that fountained up in sprays or rose in fluttering excitement like a flock of birds startled from a cornfield. They tapered into a surprising thinness, those buttresses, both for lightness and exaggerated perspective, till with the carven foliage that adorned them, they stood out against the sky like bent saplings. Roofs of vast height were narrowed, built in against the slope on their hidden side. Many of the spires and towers that seemed so solid proved to be chiefly open works of pillars and carving, intricate and delicate. But as the platform neared the top of its run, and he came among the buildings, he saw that all this, too, was a work of skill, and not just a vainglorious facade. Had the strength actually been as it was made to seem from afar, it would have been ugly and intolerable close to. The streets through which their escort hurried them would have been overshadowed valleys, deep and dank. The noble arches and doorways around dark cavern mouths, a gloom-ridden place, horribly airless and oppressive. Instead, their impressions were of brightness and space captured within the lightest possible cage of stone. Enormous windows and walls reduced their weight, and left pillars within to uphold the roof, but fair works of colored glass filled them, and the rays of the sinking sun shining through them and playing over street and wall turned the strength into a shimmering hoard of jewels. From any reasonable angle or distance, the whole vast edifice had been contrived to seem fair and consistent in itself, both its several buildings and the greater whole they made up. Some strength, perhaps, had been sacrificed. It might not have stood the rigors of an endless northern winters, so much closer to the winds and the snows off the ice. But then it was built for the south, and it was yet a place that great armies would break against, and lesser ones flee at the very sight of, and none the less a dwelling fit for all the arts of peace. Winding their way along the walls, they came at last to yet another such platform and ramp. As it lifted under them, Rock shaded his eyes against the dust glare, and looking out over the hazy magnificence of the view, he sighed in deep content.
Well, whatever else there may be, this is all the legends tell of this realm, and more. Can't you see here all the roots of Kerbrahine, of Morven, and Morvenhall, that now is? Aye, even of your own little towns in Nordney, with their painted slats. See in yonder patterned window the same style? It's well named. The strength of our folk it is, sure enough.
Elof nodded slowly. It is, for it embodies so much wisdom and skill and sheer cunning of mind and hand. This must have been a fair size of hill once. But what can you see of that? Nothing. As if they'd melted it down and molded it anew from the hot blood of the earth. There is something strange about some of these buildings. Sergeant, by your leave, gentles. Those buildings down below there. Yes, that one. And that. Look down through those huge windows and what do you see? Exactly. Nothing. They're spick and span. They've some of them painted walls or hangings, but scarce a stick of furnishing in them all. Small wonders there, sir. Them as dwells there are well content with little. Their tombs, those are. What? Every one? More'n a few of 'em, sir, aye. For in what better hollow should the kings who built the strength wish to lie? In holes befitting their glory and power. All their lives they'd be working on them,
as splendid as they could make 'em. 'Twas always intended thus, as I've heard, sirs. Hallow and palace and place of strength together, a living show of their power. As this old saying goes, the strength of Keris is its mighty tombs.
So long as it lies not buried with them, said Rock quietly, as the sergeant turned away once more. What a pile of wealth to heap upon your own dry bones.
Elof nodded. What needs the greatest of men more than 2 strides of ground, if only he leaves a worthy name? And all the show in the world cannot enhance that. Remember Dorgal Arlanen? How simple it was? And yet the feeling there?
Aye, that I do. These gilded boneyards fare ill by comparison. Oh, here's the end of our ride.
There came more streets, more looming buildings, and another ramp. This one was shorter, and ended before tall gates in an encircling wall. Upon their dark wood the image of the bull's head with gilt sun between its horns stood out in weathered relief. The platform creaked and juddered to a halt, and Elof thought he heard, echoing up from the slots below the winding gear, the distant groans and gasps of exhausted men. Then the sergeant bellowed at his shaken men, and they formed up around Elof and Rock more closely than before. As the gates ground open, the traveler saw they had at last reached the brow of that carven hill, for against the sky of evening, taller even than Elof had guessed, arose its mighty crown, the horns of the bull that held the sun. Cobbles rang beneath their feet as they marched briskly off the platform and across a wide square. Elof slipped and stumbled, for he was gazing at the towers. They looked subtly newer than the ones at their feet, and the resemblance to horns was no accident. Their outermost faces were flat and hard-edged, but the inner faces were shaped carefully into a graceful, continuous curve, as across the brows of a gigantic bull. Below them, at the level where eyes would be, stood 2 round drum turrets, many stories high and faced with graceful colonnades that flanked the front wall of a palace, a greater than any on the hill below, and a fairer. Midway in that wall, a tall arched doorway opened, and above it a wide balcony whose canopy was in the form of a high helm crowned with a circlet. The helm shone silver, the circlet with the luster of fine gold and the sunlit fire of encrusted gems. To Elof that crown, like the overwhelming towers, seemed more vulgar than splendid. It hardly seemed to belong against the calm strength of the palace, almost as if it had been added later, recently even. Then he frowned with sudden understanding. That balcony fell midway between the towers. When they captured the sun, it must seem to stand above that balcony, that helm like a crest. And how would a man seem who chose to appear beneath it then? There were sentries waiting within that arch, a great many sentries, their mail brightly gilded, the shafts of their long spears a gaudy scarlet, as were the bobbing horsetail crests on their helms. One among them bore a surcoat of black worked with the crest of the sun between horns in heavy gold thread. He stepped forward unhurriedly, without surprise, a slender man with graying blonde hair, and the sergeant saluted with great deference. Somehow, swift as the ascent had been, some message had passed more swiftly, and they were awaited. The man in the surcoat inclined his head politely to Elof.
I am Irak,
officer of the king. He will hear you at once, gentle sir, if you will come this way. But your sword, I fear, not in his presence. No one may, save his guard alone. I myself will bear it beside you, and I must search your burden also.
Elof's teeth clenched and his fist closed unbidden on Gorthar's silvered hilt. But he knew he would achieve nothing by resisting. With the best grace he could summon, he unslung the bag from his shoulder and passed it to Iroquois. Then slowly drew the sword from his belt. The officer's eyes widened as he touched its edge, and he held it gingerly by the quillins.
A noble weapon this. I understand you are a smith. Of your own forging?
Of my reforging. It was forged in the deeps of time, by a hand unknown to me. It came to me as an inheritance.
A rich one, then. It is fit to be a legendary blade of old, such as Balan that was Glaiscav's, or Talathor. That would fit its color.
Elof smiled. His lore was being gently tested. It would indeed. Talath being a word in the Old Northern for the dark, the coming dark. But whose blade might that have been? Iroquois waved them in before him. The red-crested sentries closed in behind him, leaving their escort unceremoniously out on the steps.
This way, good sirs. The king will receive you in the main hall. Only within those doors ahead. Open there! Whose sword, sir?
Why, I hoped rather that you might know that, for the last that is told of that hero was of his setting out oversea to seek the land you come from. Talathor was Lord Vade's sword, Vade the Great. Was he simply lost at sea, then? Did he never come among you, and find the hero's death foredoomed to him after all? Well, well, and has this blade a name? Elof swallowed in a dry throat. He was aware of Rock beside him, staring, speechless. Vade did come among us, sir, he answered with an effort. I am thought by many, though by what ways I know not, to be distantly of his kind. The blade has a name, sir, of my bestowing. It is Gorthar. Know you what that means?
Why, yes, said Iroquois. It means...
Then he hesitated, licked his lips, almost let fall the blade he held.
It means nightfall.
The officer hurried on. Elof followed after him, but he hardly noticed the tall arches of the outer hallway, windowless and gloomy, nor its rich murals, dimmed now in shadow, save where the declining sun shone down through the windows of the gallery above, and shed a splash of sudden color on the walls. He was elsewhere, wandering lonely over infinite gray marshes, under cool, heavy skies, with the smell of salt in his nostrils, and the sharp, black rushes rattling like an enemy's spears, the grass flowers sprinkled like a spray of fresh blood. He was seeing the mass of bodies the bog had brought up in the spring thaw, cloven corpses from 1,000 years past, some 30 or more, and one huge frame hole, still grasping a black-bladed sword. A sudden pang, and he was back at Morvanic as it was then, on that terrible, glorious night when a free people had bought their freedom anew in blood. When the light had first shone on that great statue of the Watcher, and shown him a face so like and so unlike his own. face, Vade's blade. And Corrington, who had known Vade, had seemed to recognize his very voice. Yet he was not Vade. Whatever twists and turns the river had taken, whatever the unknown parentage he cared for so little, he had never been more sure of that. Vade was reputed a giant in stature, and so the Watcher's image showed him. Vade, by such chronicles as Elof had bothered to consult, was a warlord, a schemer, a man of unpredictable and frightening temperament, as his wrath-stamped countenance suggested, wielder of a cold and deadly justice. Worse, he was certainly a necromancer who trafficked with strange forces in his strange tower, who had prolonged his life to twice that of ordinary men, and only incidentally a skilled smith. He had served good kings and good causes with ruthless loyalty, and sometimes by fell deeds they would never have countenanced themselves. What could Elof find of himself in all that? Little or nothing. If he was honest with himself, a certain ruthlessness, but not half so much. No word of love. And what had driven Elof most of his life, save the quest for love? If Vade had ever loved, no chronicler had thought to mention it. Uncertain tales were told of his eventual end, but all agreed it had come about in the turmoil when Kerbrahine drove out the refugees from Morven, whom he favored. It could well have been in the marshlands, then. He came back to himself with a start. Rock had jogged his elbow. Glancing quickly around, he saw that they stood now on the threshold of a long hall, stone-flagged and shadowy, save for a window at the far end, through which the sky of evening showed ruddy and fierce. The buzz of voices hung heavy on the darkening air. Torches and lanterns were being lit along the walls, and by their flicker they revealed a considerable company there, seated around long tables, strolling about or simply lounging, kicking their heels against the rush matting that covered most of the flags. "Not here yet," breathed Iroquois thankfully. "Come along, come. Not to be kept waiting." He led them swiftly down the middle of the hall, where lines of pillars marked out a central aisle, lit very brightly by lamps before curved mirrors of metal cunningly worked into the pillars. They revealed the flagstones worn almost into grooves beneath the mats. Iroquois halted them some 20 paces from a wide dais of white, not very high, but surmounted with an immense carven chair of oak and some kind of yellowed ivory, clearly ancient work. Its back reached twice the height of a man, with a heavy canopy of ivory above it shaped to seem like cloth billowing in a wind. Cloth intricately inlaid with gold, and each arm was a small table of ivory, their carven edges worn almost smooth by the rubbing of robed sleeves. There were images in the carvings that looked like scenes from a tale, and he was just striving to make them out when the crowds at the side rustled into sudden life, and there was a clear, single note upon a trumpet, and a voice called out, "Make clear the way! Stand aside, all men! He comes! The Lord Nithid of the Lonian, and of the Ysmirid comes, High King of the land of Kiris, and all its folk. The King comes." There was a frantic stir and rustle in the background, chairs scraping against the floor and feet shuffling, and a growing hubbub. Forgetting his other concerns, Elof waited eagerly to see this king of an ancient line, this remote kinsman of his friend Kermorven. "Think you'll be like him?" Like as was Prince Corrington?
Rock whispered. In body, who can tell? Elof whispered back. In mind and spirit? Let us hope so. There is a bond of blood.
Aye, but that's no guarantee. Some of Kermorven's kin were right sons.
He said no more, for the crowd to their right scurried apart. Many threw themselves upon their faces and beat their brows upon the matting. Everyone else fell to their knees, and all but a few, Earwack among them, bowed to the floor. He tugged furiously at Rock's sleeve. Rock glanced anxiously to Elof, who rebelled at the thought of groveling as no man did before his own revered king. But, not wishing to offend, he compromised by sinking slowly to one knee, Rock copying him, and with head erect sought his first sight of the monarch of this enormous land. But, strangely enough, it was not he who appeared first. A little girl in a bright red gown, a child of no more than 10 summers with a gold fillet around her chestnut hair, came skipping unconcernedly along the cleared way, stopping to look back and giggle. Behind her stalked older boys, tall and sturdy in cloth of gaudy green and gold, with gold bands twined about their brows. At 15 or 16, they were almost men, but their faces, though well enough, were set as arrogantly as only the rawest youth can be. Elof could see that they were chafing under the weight of the huge hands laid on their shoulders, at least in public. Well, so might he have. Perhaps he himself, at the height of his own blind self-regard, had managed to look that unpleasant. And such a father as this might lay a formidable burden on his sons. Nithade, High King of Caris, looked at first sight not the slightest bit like his kinsman oversea, past or present. Elof stared in surprise as a man of middle height, no taller than himself and even broader, a thick-set wall of a man with a round ton of a belly, bustled his children aside, then came stumping and wheezing at a great pace up onto the dais, and settled into that noble old seat with an alarming crash. The robes that streamed and billowed about him were of dark velvet, gaudily worked with a wealth of gold and silver, but neither new nor especially clean nor closely tailored, hanging comfortably loose about his immense shoulders. He was bareheaded, revealing a mane as thick and waving as Kermorven's, but black instead of bronze, and shot with streaks of gray. His beard was the same, but even thicker, spreading down to his heaving chest. Kermorven, by contrast, preferred to go clean-shaven like most folk of consequence in his land, Elof and Rock included. In fact, he carried it to extremes. Shaving with his sword's edge if he had nothing better. But then Kermorven's face was lean and handsome in a hawk-like fashion, whereas Nithade without the hair would have been coarse as a puttock, as Rock was later to put it. His skin was white, his jowls heavy and fat, and his mouth a wide, thin-lipped gash. His nose was narrow and straight, but slightly bulbous at the tip, and his brow, though high, was furrowed into a permanent frown. His eyes were oddly slanted under heavy brows, but in them some likeness to Kermorven did lurk, the same shade of mist-gray blue and a fierce raptor's alertness that spoke of great energy of mind. Sweeping the prostrate throng before him, they fastened upon Elof and Rock, and widened as if in surprise.
but any other feelings they held back like a stone wall. He grinned suddenly, his teeth gleaming very white against his beard. It was a merry grin, with the impish innocence of a child delighting in his own vast cunning. But above it the eyes were intent, considering, more like Kermorvan's than ever. The children also were looking at them, the little girl with wide-eyed fascination, the boys with a mixture of alarm and disdain. Elof guessed suddenly that word must have been sent well ahead, that this whole court must have been buzzing with news of their arrival, so that even the children had heard. Suddenly, Nithade vented a wordless bark, like a laugh cut suddenly short, and his huge ham of a hand slapped the throne arm. Elof felt the whole court twitch in fright. Then warily they looked up and began to rise. "Well?" His voice, though tinged with an accent that sounded rustic, at least compared to Earwax, was neither as deep nor as coarse as his look suggested. In fact, it was clear and mellow, with the suave music of the trained orator. He spoke words as if he relished the taste of them, his tones slightly drawling and sibilant, constantly on the brink of a chuckle. "Oh, these are our emissaries, are they? The master smith Elof Valentor, and his companion Rock, hmm?" The slight accent cut the ending from Elof's second name. "Welcome at last to your homeland, sir emissaries, though from all I hear, the savages gave you a harsher greeting first. That's one more insult we'll be repaying in due course." He eyed Elof's blood-stained clothes uneasily. "Before anything else, do you need a surgeon?" Elof bowed courteously. "No, my lord Nithade, though I thank you. I'm well enough now." Nithade gestured at the roughly mended tear in his tunic. "That's the wound. Horns of the bull, it's a marvel you're still alive." Elof smiled ruefully. "Sometimes it happens that way with me, my lord. I heal fast. I'm not sure how or why." "Oh, well, you're a smith, of course," grunted Nithade. "And smiths is strange cattle, as our country folk say. Now, do you tell me, how came you to be here, and to what purpose?" Elof gathered his wits. This fierce character would not be easily impressed. He had not missed the awe in which his court held him. "My lord, I will. We also, in the several lands west oversea, have been beset by the ice and its minions. My lord Kermorvan sent me on this quest, to reach our ancestral lands and there find, and if possible recover, a thing of value which was lost to the ice, and we guessed was brought here." "A thing you'll not name, then? Not in open court, anyway. Very well. But do you tell me, are master smiths so common in your land that they are sent on missions of great danger?" "No, my lord. But what was taken, I regarded as mine." "Some powerful work, then. Ah, well, let it pass for now. A heavy trust, and a perilous one. You must have had adventures. Tell us some." Elof had not expected that, and flushed like a child. He looked hastily at Rock, who shook his head. But under Nithade's goading, Elof told a few of their experiences, and was surprised to see how the courtiers hung on his words, how the king's beard bristled and his cheeks flared. When the Ekwesh ship was lured under the ice island, he literally roared with laughter, throwing his head back and guffawing. Even the princes lost their arrogance and listened all agog, while the little girl simply gazed at Elof with immense eyes. "Annoy not there," sobbed Nithade, thumping on his throne arm. "Do you go on, man, go on." And so we made our way south, Elof eventually concluded, until your patrols found us. That is all, my lord. We are now as you see us, and that is a poor state in which to continue our mission. We sought the lord of this land in the hope that either he would assist us against the forces of the ice, or at least aid us in returning to our own land, where we may seek help of our own. He paused slightly, but Nithade only sat back in his chair and stroked the corners of his mustache with his thick fingers. His keen eyes fixed them both, but he said nothing. "In any event, my lord," Elof resumed, assuming his most ceremonial manner to underline the formality of his request, "we are, apart from our main quest, also ambassadors from our own lord, bearing assurances of goodwill to any realm afflicted by the ice, and of particular friendship to our ancient kin of Caris, whose name is still revered among us. To them he offers the renewing of ancient ties, no matter the span of leagues or centuries that has hitherto parted us, and where alliance or aid is wished for, any he can supply. He requests also, in the name of goodwill between rulers and lords of the Ysmerian line, free passage without hindrance for his ambassadors, and any help you may be able to give them. This through Elof Valentor, his counselor and court smith, and Rock, his trusted and confidential courier, from Karen Kermorven, lord of the Ysmeren, last king of the line of Morven, first king of Morven arisen, and the folk of Nordney, Kerberhind, and Morvenhall together. He stopped. He had said something. Some word too many, there was no doubt of that. Nothing had changed. Nobody had stirred. Nithade still sat stroking his beard, but the atmosphere had changed dramatically. The very stillness was electric, like the first hush before the storm. Suddenly, he found the air of the hall stinking, stifling with the smudge of torch and lamp, the smell of human sweat, and beneath that, the almost tangible reek of fear. "What did I hear you say?" inquired Nithade softly, his voice so suave it was almost creamy. "King, was it? Lost king of somewhere, first king of somewhere else, and of some people nobody has ever heard of. King." He leaned forward suddenly, grinning still with an immense satisfaction. "Well, my learned master smith, do you learn one thing more, and that is that there is only one rightful king of all the people of Caris, wherever they may have spread to, and in whatever land they have settled, whatever barrier lies between, be it ocean or ice, or the very fires of Hela herself. And that is me. Me!" His voice had risen to a roar of startling volume. From that, almost to a scream of wrath, a storm cry that bent and uprooted his courtiers, quailing like saplings before a blast.
Noithid of the ancient line of the Asmiran, by birth, by acclaim of the nobles, and by main strength. Not some upstart, not some spawn of a rebel and a runaway, not some tag end of the blood, reared and raised ruler of a scrape or two of soil. Learn you that, and learn it well, ere the mood takes me to have it branded unto your hide.
He subsided, panting, still grinning with ferocious enjoyment of his own temper.
And by hell's black belly, when I've whipped the ice witch and her man-eaters from the gate, I'll sail a fleet of Keris across this ocean and show your princeling what it means to be a king.
Elof, standing shocked and silent, saw Rock's face turned red as his hair with fury. But this was a dangerous animal, and anger was no safe way to deal with it. He caught Rock's arm, felt it tense and subside. Nithade noted the gesture. After a moment, he muttered, more thoughtfully,
Needn't sock the place, of course. Knock it into order, that's all. Take proper account of your land holdings. Lick your peasants into line, and set them swinking as they should. Tax and toll a bit, Need a few nobles to take it in hand. Or even a good viceroy, it being so far away. If this Kermorvan's done a good job till now, might even leave him to look after it. So long's he makes me the proper submission and tribute. Could use a new source of thralls and timber. Is there good timber in your land, lad?
More than Keris and Morvenhall together could use, said Elof evenly, and great store of all else that your folk may need, if it is sought in friendship. But you will find us very short of thralls, I fear. The intent eyes fixed on Elof, unblinking, but nothing was said. Instead, he turned and beckoned peremptorily to Iroquois, who had been careful to stand well clear of the others. The officer scurried forward and laid sword and pack upon the throne arm. Nithade reached for the pack and rummaged inside it, then tipped the contents out into his lap. Elof took a step forward and opened his mouth to protest, and found scarlet spear shafts hard across his throat. Behind him, Rock cursed. Nithade looked him in the face a moment, then called out,
Arminius!
A figure detached itself from the shadowed mass of courtiers and stepped forward. He wore a livery in the black of the Smith's Guild, much like Elof's own as courtsmith, only far gaudier, broidered over breast and sleeve with gold and silver and gems and garish signs and symbols. To Elof they looked remarkably meaningless, and he guessed they were meant to impress the credulous. Otherwise, the newcomer cut an unimpressive figure, middle-sized, scrawny, and none too clean, his thinning white hair brushed sleekly back from a narrow face whose stained teeth seemed too large for it. Giving him a fixed and mirthless smirk, he bobbed his head to Nithade, with cool deference. At your command, my lord. Nithade's great hands spread out the jumble of jewels and tools in his lap. Elof could not suppress an agonized breath as he saw the few things he truly treasured so roughly treated. Emilis evidently heard him.
What do you make of this, then?
The king demanded.
Is he any kind of smith?
The courtsmith plucked each piece up one by one and held it close to his eyes, squinting and peering as he turned it round and round in his fingers, grimacing with concentration and sucking his teeth. He clucked with surprise when he came upon Gorthar, and as he looked up from it, his watery blue eyes fastened on Elof with a malice so immediate and obvious it startled him. He shrugged, and his horse's teeth bared in a smile. "Oh, aye, it's pretty stuff enough, but bare and barbarian, not enough ornament, no style, old-fashioned, rough. What's this supposed to be?" He bent down and rummaged in the tool bag, and to Elof's alarm, he drew out the gauntlet with its crystal in the palm. "It protects my hand when I must handle hot things," said Elof, perfectly truthfully. The smith tossed it back and straightened up with a high braying laugh. "We don't cuddle ourselves thus in this land, sonny. I was taught to take my burns and like it when I was an apprentice half your age. And you claim you're a master smith." "I bear the stamp," said Elof evenly, though the spear still crossed at his throat. "Come paw at that, if you will. But I am not the master smith, only one of many, and I serve as court smith, I allow." Amalus shrugged. "Not here, you wouldn't, my lad. Not at your age. Got to sweat for your mastery here." Nithade, whose brows had drawn together at mention of a court, cut him short. "One of many, eh? Well, well. Can you make anything of him, Amalus? That's what I want to know." Amalus wrinkled his nose as if some bad odor lay beneath. "Well, since I never have enough help, I might, given time. He's got good thews on him, and at least I'd not have to teach him to tell gold from brass." Nithade waved his hand. "He's yours, then. And the other, he looks strong enough, too." Elof stood speechless, aghast. Amalus' heavy-lidded eyes drooped, and he thrust out his head like a turtle's. "Many thanks, my lord. But since he's shown himself so forward and unruly, he might prove recalcitrant, eager perhaps to seek his native land." "I'd thought of that for myself," said the burly man shortly. "Well, I'm not having him tattling tales back to his dunghill cock of a princeling. I've troubles enough for now, without one more fly to squash. Make sure you keep him well fettered, that one." "My lord, fetters of iron and steel will hardly hold even a half-educated smith. Might it not be better to—" Nithade grimaced. "Oh, very well, then, if you must." The smith gestured, and suddenly Elof found himself seized and flung forward on the ground. He gathered his strength and flung off one of his captors, but many more piled in upon him. And while he still threshed, something solid rapped the back of his skull. Not hard, but enough to jar and confuse him. Moments passed as his mind whirled. A wooden gag was thrust between his teeth, and his worn breeches ripped from calf to knee. Still, he did not understand. Not till his sight cleared and he saw Amalus bending over him, with the black blade in his hand. He heard Rock swear hoarsely, and a sound of furious struggle. Then, into his leg, just behind the knee, a dart of searing agony drove. All his muscles knotted with the pain of it. Fire roared in his head. His heart hammered against his ribs till he thought he must die. Wished he would, then knew, in a flood of dull, panting agony, that he would not. The hands that held him did not relax. He caught his breath, and in that instant, it happened again. Somewhere in the roaring furnace he was aware of the gag splintering between his teeth, and then the bellowing redness surged up and overwhelmed him. He blinked, aware of a sudden blessed cold chill of flooding wetness. He still lay face down upon the same flags, but they were soaking. Somebody had thrown water over him. He raised his head a little, saw a guard tipping more water from a leathern bucket onto rock, stretched senseless on the matting with a trickle of blood running from his nose. He stirred and groaned. Somewhere a young girl was sobbing. Elof, confused, looked around and saw it was the child, kneeling beside the throne and gaping at him wide-eyed with horror, hardly hearing Nithade's bluff attempts to comfort her. "Happens all the time. See, go to. He's not sore hurt. He's looking at you now. No need to take on so. He'll be right as rain in a few minutes. It was just to stop him running away, that's all, when he might be valuable. You'll have to learn to look after your own thralls one day, if it's a proper princess you want to be. Come now, here's a pretty present for you." And with no more ado, he picked up the two halves of the arm ring and slipped them over the little girl's shivering forearms. It seemed to Elof that something actually snapped inside his head. He struggled furiously to spring up, to cry out, to howl in horror and outrage. But the splintered gag filled his mouth, and such a bolt of agony lanced through him when he tried to move his legs that he almost vomited against the gag. He forced himself to be still. His legs had refused to obey him, had scrabbled and scraped limply against the stone, as he had seen in dying things, beasts and men. The pain faded, and he lay there gasping, breaking out in a cold sweat. But as the agony faded, there was a sudden, sickening sense of release in his lower legs that was almost worse. Fear caught at his throat. As through a fog he heard Nithade crooning, "There, that's better, isn't it? And you can wear them as two for now. And then, when you're older... No, don't go bothering Master Amalus. He'll be too busy. Run along now, and show them to your nurse." Elof was fighting a frantic battle with the jagged panic in his mind. He could not face what had been done to him. Slowly, choking down his rising gorge, he forced himself to rise a little on one elbow and look at one outflung leg. One glimpse was enough. He slumped down so limply that his head rang dizzyingly on the flagstones. It had not been hewn off, as something in him had whispered, but behind his knee there were deep wounds, still bleeding, and he knew they meant something almost as terrible. Amalus had simply severed the great tendon behind each knee, and so destroyed the leverage of the limbs. They had hamstrung him beyond healing, and made a lifelong cripple of him. He would never be able to walk again. Nithade and the court smith were looking at him. There was open gloating in the older man's eye, but not in Nithade's. He bore the satisfied look of one who has seen a disagreeable matter of business done with. Fury went shuddering through Elof like the winds through a forest, and sent his fears whirling away on the blast. To the forest he thought back, to the pine floor. What had he achieved there? What had he unleashed to heal himself? With that fury as a spur, he delved deep into his mind, searched for the same source he had tapped, the same inner strength he poured into his work. He imagined it like some precious pure metal spilling white-hot from the furnace, flooding through his veins till they shone hotly bright, spreading, searching, seeking the flaw in his flesh that it might flow into, heal, and restore. Almost at once, though he had scarcely managed to believe it, the pain grew less. That sickening limpness began to fade. If he could keep this up. Then from behind him came a gruffly alarmed shout. "My lords, he has stopped bleeding."
"What?"
he heard Amalus exclaim.
"Impossible. Let me see. Unless he's dying."
"Oh, noble lord. Even as I watched, the bleeding slowed suddenly and stopped. Just stopped. Formed no clot. Nothing. And the wounds. The sides of it. See?"
"What is this creature?"
he heard Nithade mutter, and his wrist was seized.
"He said he healed fast, and by the powers it was no lie. Would it had been. Is it safe to hold him, Amalus?
Had we not simply slay him out of hand, and scatter his ashes?" Amalus snorted furiously.
"I've a better remedy than that, and he himself has supplied the means."
Quick footsteps sounded, and from across the floor he heard Rock's warning shout. Looking up, he saw the mastersmith Amalus bearing down on him. But it was what he held in his hands that chilled Elof's heart. "No!" screamed Elof through the gag, and forgetting the agony, he struggled somehow to rise, fought like a madman to find something he could spring himself on, to roll away. But at the smith's curt order, more hands seized him. He snarled like a wolf and bit, but a spear shaft pinned him to the floor. Then, for the second time, 2 brands of pain unimaginable thrust into his legs. Terrible as the first pains were, he had not yet screamed. But now he did, and shattered the gag with the force of it. The pains were no worse, but the torment of heart and spirit was a horror he could not endure. He clutched at death even as he had clutched at life, willing his heart to shatter, his mind to blow out like a candle in a cold wind, and the shadows around him to rush in. Horrifying as what they had done to him already was, this was worse. He howled his sorrow like a beast, for indeed it defied words. Yet somewhere, some part of him in a strange, mad isolation, he could think with frightening clarity. Had Kara felt that last agony even as he had, wherever she was, far or near? Had she too felt bars of metal shut about her soaring spirit, the measure of her days caught in? Did she curse him then, knowing it was his doing? For Amalus had spoken truer than he guessed. He himself had forged the fetters that henceforth must bind him to the end of his days, that he would never dare force open. He had sought to bind Kara. Far more terribly, he had bound himself. For he had shaped those silver anklets which Amalus had thrust through the wounds in his legs, between the very bones, and snapped firmly shut. The clasps were cunning. Who knew that better than he? Since they were meant to bind Kara, he had shaped them never to be opened again once shut. As Amalus must have seen, he had also made the anklets strong, almost impossible to break. Kara might have done it in her power, but caught up in them, she would not wish to. Elof might manage it, but he would not, for with them he would break Kara. As they closed, a circle closed that should never have taken shape anywhere save where it was intended, around Kara's own flesh. For into the anklets, with a hair and a feather, no more, he had woven a part of the fate of that flesh. Closed around her, that would not have mattered. If they were somehow broken there, what was taken could return to her. Only the virtue would be dispelled. But if they broke now, that vital shred of her existence would dissipate. The effect upon her could only be guessed. She might not die as a mortal might, but that change she had foreseen would surely come in ways he could not imagine, and surely she would be lost to him. That was a risk he had chosen to run. That was what Kara had hurled in his face. And never more clearly than now was his own confident and ruthless folly brought home to him. Unless those bonds were broken, he could never, ever be healed. He screamed, or he wept like a child. He did not know. He hardly noticed that hands were smearing numbing salves upon him, tying rough bandages about his wounds. Not until the face of Amalus swam into the emptiness of the world before him did he take notice. Then, all in an instant, the fit passed, and he raised himself upon one elbow. He saw the king's sons, staring at him with amused, gloating looks on their faces. Evidently, they had enjoyed what they saw. He saw Rock, sitting up beside him, clutching his head and staring in wordless horror at what had been done to Elof. To neither did he pay any heed, any more than to the fire between his bones. For a moment, another face seemed to swim before his eyes, seamed and grim. A clear, cool wind of hatred and wrath blew through him, and brought him sudden strength. On one arm he raised himself and looked clear-eyed at the court smith. Then he spoke, and the man took an involuntary step back. "Amalus!" The name grated from his throat. "Liar and fool I name you, and false to your lord. You knew me for what I am from the first moment you saw me. A smith of craft and skill far greater than you could ever command. You feared me, lest I show the world how feeble you truly are. And you hated me, 'cause I could not help showing it to you. So you lied to your lord. You sought me as a thrall, to pass off my work as your own, or at least keep me from others, and in time be quietly rid of me. All this to stop me supplanting you." He felt lightheaded. He seemed to have no body, as if the fire had burned it to ashes and the wind dispersed them. He existed only as feelings and the words they spawned. Yet you had nothing to fear from me, Amalus. Not then, but you do now. For your mean ends, you crippled me. Yet that is not a tenth part of the greater wrong you have done. You are a flawed casting, Amalus, and I shall shatter you. The voice he spoke in had stilled the babble of the court. His words echoed with a somber certainty between the stone walls. The court smith flushed red, then white, so choked with his wrath that he could not get out his answer. But it was the king that Elof looked to, Nithade, to whom his words had truly been addressed, slumped reflectively in the great chair. It was Nithade who answered him, with not a trace of the anger that had gripped him a shorter time since. It fits a thrall to guard his tongue better, Master Valent, he said soberly. He gestured out into the shadows of the hall, towards a pillar upon which something hung, gleaming red in the deceptive flicker of the light. It looked horribly like a dismembered body for a moment, till Elof realized it was a suit of armor, with a bronze-hued breastplate. Amalus is no mean smith. He's made for me some fine things. The latest, that armor. Better than any king of Caris has had since the old days and the lost arts of our ancestors. Are they lost? Asked Elof softly, though a sudden shiver of weakness gripped him. That sword of mine that this Nithing turned against me. Take it from him and look. Be wary. Aye, it cuts, does it not? And is it not fair? 1,000 years could not blunt that edge. I know, because it is older than that. But when it was ruined and bent, I was able to reforge it. Could he, craft and skills I have that have never been lost, king, and others that I have found anew for myself. But do not think me an idle boaster, king. Put us to the proof. Set my sword against his armor. The court erupted. Nithade looked at him wide-eyed a moment, then let out his barking laugh. My fear us, sweet apples. At least you promise good sport. What say you to that, court smith? Amalus elaborately did not look at Elof. My lord, even a broken-backed serpent may be dangerous. By my counsel, you will not risk yourself even slightly. Risk? Inquired Nithade quietly, but with a flash of his frightening eyes. What's this of a sudden about risk? After all you've told me of that armor. My lord, said Amalus, treading confidently but delicately, as does a man used to avoiding traps. You yourself called my armor the best and strongest since the elder days. Yet kings were slain even then, clad in their mightiest armor, not least by the sly hands of traitors. I would not have you expose yourself to such perils lightly. Test it at need, my lord, in battle, but not for so petty a matter. In battle? Repeated Nithade, and suddenly his blue eyes were very like Cremorvin's.
In battle, aye. That would be more appropriate, would it not? In battle, where if it fails, I fail, and am in no case to take the matter further. Interesting.
His voice had a mildness in it that made Elof squirm.
However, as usual, you are right. I cannot risk it. Not out of fear, lest it should have crossed anyone's mind, but because I will not put my land in jeopardy lightly, not with my sons still young, the ice witch sniffing about our doors, and now this outlander princeling.
He shook his head over the many inequities of life, then looked up.
Therefore, Master Smith Amalus, I think you shall don the armor, and meet the challenge in my stead.
Someone at the back of the court gave a snort that sounded like sudden laughter, instantly stifled. Amalus's hooded eyes were unreadable, but he bowed.
"Where the idea, lord, but I crafted it most painstakingly to fit only your frame." "Oh, come, Amalus," Nithade rumbled. "No need for such tact. We're much of a height, and you can pad yourself out all you like to match my belly and the rest. You'll have a few days to prepare, till this one's fit to face you. So, that's settled then, eh? Good. Very good. Guards, take 'em off, these two. See they have healing and all else they require, but keep 'em secure. Your heads'll answer for theirs. And while you're about it, see their food is tasted. A shame if they met some ill fortune before their appointed day, huh? Off with you then."
The appointed day dawned earlier than any of them had expected. "Nithade seems to be impatient for his sport," remarked Elof.
"Sport?"
growled Rock, as he helped Elof step by painful dragging step to a bench.
"This is plain murder. Tell him you're not healed yet. Refuse. You can hardly stay upright on your crutches, let alone put any weight on those legs of yours, splints or no."
"Rock, I'm aware of that. And so is he. Do you think he'd care? Was I strong enough to strike a blow? That was all he wanted to know." They turned to look at Nithade, sprawled across his chair. He waved a jovial hand at them, and turned to bandy some remarks with his sons who stood beside him. Elof was glad that the little girl, at least, had been spared this. Courtiers came out as they neared the bench, and helped them in. They seemed cruelly amused, some of them, but not unkindly. Elof guessed that the court smith had made himself no great favorite, and they would be glad to see him fail. But from the wagers he could hear bandied about, few favored Elof's chances. A murmur parted the crowd, and from out of the shadows strode a figure it was hard to recognize as Amalus. From head to toe he was carapaced in metal of a shimmering bronze hue, shaped to Nithade's bulky frame. Upon the breastplate from midriff to throat, it bore in traceries of gold the sign of the bull's horns holding the sun, in a coiling, cluttered, florid style. The same gaudy decoration wound across every surface, spreading out along the limbs, for instead of mail, they were encased in metal shells, with discs bearing the sun design to shield the joints and hinges, and at the brow and sides of the visored helm. In one hand he bore a heavy mace of matching hue, with many narrow ribs, and a sun disk at its head.
"Plate armor,"
hissed Rock.
"A whole suit of plate, and solid by the ring of it."
Elof glared and said nothing, but there was a sickness in him greater than any pain. He had bargained on some plate armor, but this was a whole suit of it. It was far easier to fashion, but crude compared to the subtle shapings of mail that the best smiths could accomplish. Few active men sought to encase themselves in so heavy and cumbersome a guard, preferring ringmail with added body plates. Knights of the warrior order of ancient Morven, with their fast, fluid craft of fighting, preferred less plate. Kermorven used only light plates at shoulder, elbow, and knee, and sometimes the breastplate that bore the crest of his line. Plate might shield the wearer from some blows, but hindered him in avoiding others. Here, avoidance was not at issue. If Elof could not make good his boast at one stroke, he could not move to avoid its counter. That mace would dash out his smithcraft forever, and all the hopes and fears and follies that went with it.
"Let me do it,"
hissed Rock fiercely.
"I've the strength. I'll have the bastard's head off before a man can move."
And yours would follow. No, Rock. You've got yourself a bad rap on the head already by trying to help me. Look to yourself, rather. Don't worsen my fall by sharing it.
"'Twasn't much. I gambled a dunt on the head against a chance of wringing that scrawny neck. Had the same idea as you, I guess. Only I might have saved your legs, and worse. Those anklets,"
he groaned under his breath.
"Oh, Powers, what's the point? What can we ever hope to do now?"
Elof's heart sank like an ember. If even Rock was despairing. But Nithade was speaking.
"You there, give the man his sword. And you, his friend, get him to his feet. Be you his prop for now."
He left unsaid what was obvious, that if Elof failed, Amlis would soon see he needed no support ever again. "Listen, Rock," said Elof suddenly, as they shuffled into a circle lit by many lamps, summer eve though it was outside. "When I give the word, let me go. Yes, let go. Only for a moment. You'll see why." But then Nithade raised a peremptory hand, and Amlis clanked forward to face him, only 2 strides away. Iroquois put the cool hilt of Gorthar into his hands, and with it the memories of that last shattering stroke against another and greater evil, of the lightning that had bathed it and driven it deep into solid iron. Elof drew a deep, shuddering breath, and Nithade let fall his hand. Amlis stepped forward with a clatter of metal and raised the mace high. "Now!" cried Elof, and swinging up Gorthar, he flung his arm free from Rock. Both hands met on the hilt, and with that singing snarl the black blade flew high above his head. Amlis looked up. He could not help it, and for all his own wiry strength, the weight of mace and armor took on his toll on his arm. He lost a moment of his swing, and in that instant, swaying on legs that were already collapsing under him, Elof brought Gorthar hissing down. Weakened as he was, his arms still held a strength few even among smiths could equal. The black blade struck like the lightning that had forged it anew. It met the mace, reaped the head from it like a cornstalk, and fell upon the helm beneath, smashing away the visor. The breastplate rang like a bell as it passed, and leaped up in baffled fury against the flagstones. The rebound tore it from Elof's fingers, and he toppled. Rock caught at him, but he crashed down onto the stones, and agony convulsed his half-healed legs. The black sword skittered away across the floor to Nithade's feet. Amylus's face, revealed in the broken visor, wore a look of startled relief. But only for a moment. A flicker of vast surprise crossed it. He opened his mouth to speak or cry out, choked, coughed, and staggered in a jangle of metal, fighting with the collar of the suit. Blood gushed out of his mouth, and blood-stained toe erupted from the riven breastplate, slashed like soft tin from breast to waist. He hit the flagstones with a jingling crash. Plate squealed and scraped as his legs kicked along the flagstones a moment, and fell gradually still. In the hushed silence that followed, Nithade rose ponderously from his throne, bent down with a breathy grunt to pick up Gorthar, and gingerly thumbed the edge that had struck. "Not in the least blunted," he announced, as if not in the least surprised. Elof, fighting to breathe against the shock of pain, could not answer. Nithade prodded the corpse with the toe of his boot. "So there you lie, Amylas," he said dryly, "for all your craft and cunning. Fool! Did you think me so blind I could not tell for myself the better man? But you were ever a schemer, and want to force matters. Guards, take this trash away, armor and all." Elof found his voice, though his head was swimming. "You knew? You knew? Then why did you force me to this?" Nithade shrugged. "As I said, good sport. Though, as it turns out, I am rid of a mediocre smith and accomplished intriguer, in a way that his powerful kindred cannot lay at my door. I could not be absolutely sure, after all, could I?" He hefted Gorthar and clucked at it delightedly. "And I have a new court smith, who is related to nobody, and ill-placed to interfere, and even go where I do not want him. Your first task, by the way, will be to make me a new armor, and I have a most remarkable sword." "That sword is mine," grated Elof. "And you are mine, Valant," replied Nithade levelly, "and so also all that belongs to you." "I am nothing of yours. You may have tricked me into becoming your murderer, Nithade, but you cannot compel me to work for you." Nithade motioned to the guards, and they dragged Elof swiftly to the dais foot. The jolting pain sickened him to silence. He could feel blood oozing from an opened scar. "Let us understand one another, you and I," said the king. "You are mine, either as an outlander thrall, or as a subject of the rightful king of Keras and all its domains. Makes no difference.
but it could. Do well by me, and you both will prosper. But if not, well, I would not coerce a mastersmith such as you with common threats. I would only apply to you the law which governs any man, left to himself, that if you do not work, you do not eat.
He shifted his glance to Rock.
But this sturdy fellow here...
Rock growled deep in his throat.
Do your worst. This sturdy fellow, as I was about to say, I would not waste so. You also would have to work, but in some heavy labor, fettered among felons, or, if need be, blinded, as I guess you are also some kind of smith. I think we would have years of work from you, after hunger and thirst first begin to bite. But I would not rather leave you to look after your friend. He may need you, and he cannot flee. You alone would not get far if you tried, for from his account of your voyage, I learned you are scarcely a sailor. The one cannot escape. The other cannot use any freedom he might gain. What do your own efforts tell you?
He leaned forward earnestly, fixing them with a gaze grown suddenly keen.
But do not mistake me. The ice is your enemy. So also it is mine. And does it not threaten us more closely here than in your homeland? Well then, do we not need you more urgently here? I would far rather count you as free servants, helping me with the same skill and valor you have displayed. You came asking me for aid, and I never gainsayed you. I mean to drive back those reavers, storm the gate, and make it ours again. Hang the ice witch from it by her own ensnaring hair. But to do that, I need to unite this land, build up my power. Help me in that, and you'll flourish. When I trust you, I might even have those fetters struck off.
Elof shook his head violently, too violently. The palace chamber shook around him.
No, King. Never.
That? Never. These are deep waters of smithcraft you cannot understand. Let the fetters be. I am resigned to them. But that broken arm ring? I can forge another as fair for the little princess. Let me at least have that back, King, for it is a dear and bitter memory to me. Nithade tapped his teeth with a ridged thumbnail.
As Beethel is to me, all that is left me of her mother. I will not take from her what I have bestowed, and I know she will not give it up for any reward. Not now, anyway. In a few years, when she is suitably wedded, perhaps, she may put it aside. I can only counsel you to wait. But what's that, man, however dear, to what you could gain? A man like you could earn a title, even, and estates. You'll hold them 100 times better than many born to them.
Weakness and bleak despair welled up around Elof. His breath came fast, and fearing he would faint, he threw up his hands to stop Nithade in his flow. No, King. The ice is our enemy, but we have little common cause.
I've seen your land and how you rule it. And beside the king I serve, you were a brigand chieftain, Nithade. No more. A horrified buzz of voices arose in the court, and many shrank back. But though Nithade's eyes narrowed, he did not interrupt. To suit yourself you have maimed me, made me your tame murderer, and taken from me things greater than you can guess. I will serve you because I must, under duress, as a thrall only. Never freely, never loyally. You lack the coin that could buy that of me. I will set great craft in your hand, but only as long as it is turned against the ice. Cease that struggle, turn aside from that fight, and I will serve you as you deserve. I will crush you, Nithade. The silence, once he finished, could not have been more shattering than while he spoke. Nithade's hands had closed hard on the leading edges of the throne arms, white-knuckled, quivering, as if to tear the ivory asunder. His face was bloodless, his eyes staring, his lips working with words half-formed. A great lock of hair had fallen across his eyes unheeded, and they were screwed up to inhuman slits. Then suddenly, he threw his head back and bayed like a wolf, a great whooping crow of laughter. You'll crush me, will ya? How, lad, how? Under your crutches? By hopping on me? Oh, it'd be worth it just to see you try. He doubled up with the force of his mirth, hugging himself till tears shone on his cheeks and his nose ran into his beard. And his courtiers, as soon as they were sure of his mood, joined in, whooping with laughter and even mimicking a cripple's gait. Enough! Barked Nithade suddenly, slapping his hand down on the arm of the throne. Learn this one's courage, some of you. Then you may mock him. But you, Valiant, hear me. Serve me as anything you like, so long as you serve me well. And as for slaying me, why, when you feel ready, I give you leave to try. Elof had raised himself on his arms at that, though they trembled under him, and the blood roared in his ears. He thrust out a hand, and he could not see it tremble. I hear you, king. So be it. So be it. The walls spun about him faster and faster. The torches flared up and danced like marsh lights. And like the marshes, weighing down his limbs, pressing suffocatingly upon his chest, the darkness behind them reached up to enfold him, envelop him, and suck him down.